This is going to be the first video in a little series that we're going to be doing on persistence. So what I mean by persistence is, if you're familiar with games like Rust and DayZ, when you, let's say, we'll focus on DayZ. So when you take damage, so let's say you're at half health, for example, and you pick up an item in the world, and you end up being up on top of a roof. And let's say you log out of the server. Well, when you log out of your server, all of that information is saved somewhere to a database or a local file, depending on the game. Again, this would most likely take place on the server. If it doesn't, you're going to have some issues if it's multiplayer, but this is all going to be stored somewhere. So in our case, we're going to be storing that type of info in MySQL. And when you relaunch and go back into that server, you would spawn back up on top of that building, on top of the roof, with whatever object you picked up with half health. And that's what we're going to be doing. So we're going to be doing that with stats. So we're going to be saving things like our health, our coordinates in the world, so like our X, Y, and Z coordinates, and that kind of stuff. So to begin, we're going to create a MySQL database. And if you have never installed MySQL Workbench or anything like that before, or just gotten this all set up, I do have a video on it that is part of the Nazi Zombie series that I made, and it'll pretty much cover everything. So if you need help with that, that'll be linked down in the description below that you can watch, so you'll at least be up to this step. Then you just have to create a new connection, and once you're in there, you would go through and right click and create a new schema. Or if you don't have any, I think there's a button down here that says to do so, I can't recall. And we're going to give it the name of, let's do persistence, or we're going to do player persistence. And hit apply. Now we go back over to it, player persistence. We're going to right click on tables, create a table, and we're going to give this one a name of player data. Now for the column, the first one's going to just be ID. It's going to be of the integer type. Then I want to have another one, and this one's just going to be for now it's just going to be our X coordinate, because we're going to be doing this small as little tests. So we're going to only have 2 parameters for now. Well, actually, yeah, why not? We'll do Y chord and Z chord, just to keep it simple. I don't know if there's anything like a vector inside of MySQL or not, but if there is, I'll end up Googling it after this. So for our X coordinate, Y coordinate, and Z coordinate, we're going to change the data type to a float. Like so. And default values are going to be 0. Now we can simply hit apply. Good to go. Let's go ahead and view our player data table. So we hit right click on it and select rows, and here we can see our table. So I'm going to go ahead and just put in one entry. So ID 0, X coordinate 127, blah, blah, blah. I completely missed the decimal. And there's our entry. So here's our first entry. I'm not sure if that just rounded it or not. So does this only have a total of 6, I'm guessing? Oh, yeah, it goes. So I guess it only has a precision up to 6. So that's not really much of an issue that I can think of, because we are going to be rounding off. We're going to be losing some precision when we go to send it inside of Unreal Engine, because we're going to do that purposely. So we'd send a smaller amount of data to our API. Even though it's an extremely small amount, it's not really that important, but we're going to be looping through the characters or all the connected players periodically and saving them. Depending on the size of the server, this could just be one of those small little things that you can do to make a little bit of an improvement. So we have our data table set up. Next thing we want to do is create our Kotlin project. So we're going to go ahead and go to this website here, which I've already done. And my food's done. I will be right back. Alrighty, so to continue, we're going to want to go ahead and select create our project, Kotlin, and give it the name of your choice. In my case, I'm going to do persistence tutorial. And for description, for me, just persistence YouTube tutorial. Okay, once that's done, we have 3 dependencies we want to add. So we want to add spring.web, Spring Web, Spring Data JPA, and the MySQL driver. So we're going to search for Spring, find Spring Web, Spring Data JPA, and the MySQL driver. Once you have those, click Generate, and I've already done that. So you'll just have a .zip, open that up, extract it to wherever you want. In my case, I did it right here. And then to open it, just go to File, Open, select the project wherever you extracted it to, press OK, and it'll go through, do its thing, load it, and set it up. And once that's done, you'll be met with this screen here. So to sum up, what we're going to be doing in this video, here's just an example I did beforehand. We have the model. So let me go ahead and actually open that up so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So here's our to-do, this class right here. So we have an ID, which is a type integer or long, whatever you want, and then text, which in this case, it's going to be a string inside of Kotlin. So we model it to be matching our table. So we have our class, we have ID, which is of type long, and then another one called text. So the names match and the types match as well. Same thing goes for the name of the table. And once you have that, Kotlin can handle pretty much everything else for you. Now, then we're going to go through and create a controller. Now, the controller is kind of, as the name states, controller. If you watched my Nazi Zombie tutorial when we did the web API and ASP.NET, we had a bunch of different controllers. So one controller would handle our main menu, information like the servers and all that kind of stuff. The other one could handle things like your player information. So these would all be specific to what you're trying to do. So in this case, we have a controller that is for our, it's going to be the IP address of the server. So for example, in this case, if we entered in this, what we would get is a call that will call our getAll function in our interface that would return every single entry that we have in our data table, in our table. So in this case, it's just calling a procedure. I did that as a test to see how to actually call one. So I have this procedure here called getEverything, which all it does is literally this. So that was a test. So we can do it to call procedures that way too. But thankfully, Kotlin also comes with other methods that we can call, such as if we do .findAll, that will do the exact same thing that this was doing. So it automatically handles the, well, it's going to be getting every entry inside the table. There's also a bunch of others like save, and that'll do the exact same thing as well. And you can do just a bunch of different things like that. Just Control Z. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing. So to begin, first thing we want to do is open up our main Kotlin and then our .kt file right here. We also want to open up resources, application.properties. Inside of application.properties, this info will be in the description, if I remember. You want to paste all this in there. So it's going to be kind of your path, so to speak, to the database, then your username and your password. So where it says DBName, this is where you go through and replace it. So here I have 4 different ones. So I have Kotlin testing, player persistence, and trophy. In our case, we want to do player persistence. So we want to be the name of our schema. So we paste that in there. Go ahead and set your username to whatever it is. In my case, I'm going to leave it. And same thing with password. So I'm going to do my password real quick and close this so y'all don't see it. So give me a second. Actually, first, let me show you what happens when you run it with invalid information. So I'm going to go ahead and run this, and if you don't have the option to run it, by the way, this is in the IntelliJ IDE, you go to your .kt, right-click, and hit run. It'll go through, build it, and run it. So what's going to happen? It's going to go through, and it'll say processed finished. Now, this is a REST API, so it should be continually running. However, in this case, it closed. That's because the information here is invalid, so it's not making a successful connection to, I'm being blind as a bat, our database. So we should be able to see no active profile set. And it goes through and it tries to connect, but it cannot. So let me show you what happens when we have the correct information. Okay, so I now have the correct information, and I'm going to go ahead and run it. As you can see, it has not finished. Instead, it's still running. So we know that our setup is good to go, and it's establishing a connection to our database. So now that we have that, we can go ahead and make a quick test to just make it return something. So we're going to do that with our controllers. So we're going to do @REST controller. It should include it for you, hopefully anyways. Class. And here we want to give it a name that kind of resembles it. So I'm going to do persistence. No, let's do player data REST controller. And from here, we're going to do @get mapping. And we're just going to do example. And I'll show you what example does here in a second. So now we just want to create a function. Let's just do example again. Well, example function. And it's going to return a string. We're just going to return hello there and see what happens. So now when I run this, let's make sure it runs just fine. When I go to this address, so localhost 8080, nothing's going to happen. But when I go /example, it prints out hello there. So that's what this get mapping does. So it kind of redirects where we have everything. So if I do get example, however you pronounce that, like so, press enter. And I just realized I got to rerun it. My bad. Let me refresh. It prints out hello there. And if I go back to the normal example and refresh, it gives us an error. So you can control where the paths go from right there. So there's also, I think it's just mapping. And you just do mapping. And then you could just have a general one. I'm going to do API. So, what is that not right? Go to just do, is it something else? What is it? Hang on, let me check real quick. Okay, so it's not mapping, it's request mapping. That was my fault. So in here, we're just going to do API. Get rid of that import and run it. So now we should be doing API /example. And now we're gifted with hello there. So we can index that we do API for obviously our API because it's going to be acting as an interface between our game, well, our server for the game and our database. So this is like our middleman. So this is going to be what gets our information and retrieves it, or sorry, gets it and saves it to the database. Next up, let's go ahead and actually try to have it get all of our entries inside of the database. So we're going to have it retrieve this information here. So to do that, we have to create the class or the model for it. So we're going to do @entity class. Now here's where we have to do the name. So we do player data. So the name of the table. Player data. We want to pass in @ID, @generated value. And the parameters inside of generated value are going to be strategy equals generation type dot identity. Let me bring these down just to kind of clean it up a bit. And as you can see, we have an issue with ID, but we'll deal with that here in a second. And next up come the parameters. So we want to have ID as an integer, X, Y, and Z chord as floats. So we're going to match those up the same. So we're going to do val because it's going to be a kind of like, I think val is like a constant in Kotlin. I don't know exactly. Again, I'm quite new to Kotlin. ID of the type long and set it to 0. And we're going to do var xcord. That's going to be of xcord. That's going to be of type float, and set that equal to 0. Then var ycord, again float, and set it equal to 0. Then var zcord, float, and set it to 0. So we're matching up the parameters with these values here that we have in our data table. So ID, xcord, ycord, zcord with the same data types. So now we have to fix our ID. So if we hover over it, we can press Alt Shift, or we'll just do Alt Enter. And we have the option to import. And where we want to import from, we don't want to do the Spring framework. We want to use the JavaX persistence. I tried the other one and I had a fun time trying to figure out exactly where the issue was coming from. Turns out the include was wrong, but everything else just fine. So once we have our entity created, what we can do is create our interface. So we're going to do interface. Then we want to have the name. So player data repository. Then we want that to inherit from JPA repository, and it's a template, so we want to pass in the type, which in our case is going to be player data. And then for the ID, we're going to do long. So inside of here, we don't have to do anything as of yet, but this is where we're going to set up custom functions that we want to have to call. So if we want to create one that, for example, calls a procedure inside of like this one here called get everything, we can do so. So that's what we're going to be using interfaces for. We're also going to be using it to call default functions that Kotlin provides for us. Well, not necessarily Kotlin, but JPA provides for us. At least I think it's through JPA anyways. So we're going to pass in the repository, our interface, to our REST controller. So we're going to do val player data repo, and it's going to be of the type player data repository. And that allows us from here, we're no longer going to be returning a string. What we're going to do is return player data repo dot find all. And if we look at what this returns, it returns a list of type player data. So this is no longer going to be a string, it's going to be a list of type player data. So this should return us this entry in the table. Well, it's actually going to return an array, but that's going to be one of the entries. So we run it, go through, localhost, it was API / example, I think. Yeah, press enter, and here we have it, even though it's, for some reason it's arranged oddly. But we have it returning with the ID, our Z coordinate, which is there for some reason, our X coordinate, which is second, and our Y coordinate, which is third. So they're a little out of order, but I'm not entirely sure why, but they're all there and set up. So we are pretty much good to go. It went through, got everything we needed from our database. So there's not really much else to do. So instead of stopping here, I'm going to rename this from example to, let's just do player data. That'll be a decent one. And instead of having all this extra stuff, what we can do with Kotlin is we can set a function equal to something for the return type. So instead of doing the function, then the return type, and then the body, what we can do is the function equals player data repo dot find all, just like so. And it will work the exact same way. So if you recall, I changed this from example to player data, so this is no longer going to work. So I have to change example to player data. And now we have our example here again, except now we have it in X, Y, and Z properly. So I don't know why those keep changing, but obviously I don't know what the issue is there or why it's doing that, but I'm not too worried about it. So we know that everything is good to go and working. The only thing I'm going to do now is change this from example functions to get all entries. Or let's just do get all. And that's it. So I'm going to do I was like, no, it's not Control Shift. It was just a build project. So we are good to go. We have our MySQL database set up, as well as we have our little web API here set up as well in Kotlin. So now that we have that, we can start adding a bunch of functionality to this, make a couple different variations of this that go through and actually allow us to post information to it. So we're going to be using Postman for that. We're going to be passing in a JSON object and trying to save it to the database. We're going to get the basics of all that working, and then we're going to move on to Unreal Engine, where we actually can start having a little bit more fun. So, this is dragged on about 20 minutes, so that about 10 minutes longer than I wanted it to, but we have the base laid out and we are good to go. So if you like what I'm doing and you want to help support me, you can find a link to my Patreon down in the description below. If you have any questions, anything like that, feel free to join my Discord server. That's also linked down there where you can find help for any of these videos that you may have questions on. And another thing with the Patreon, we also have a Patreon only series in there where we go through and create a team deathmatch game mode from the ground up with a couple different features like a weapon customizer, enemy-based spawn, so you spawn farthest away from enemies and all that kind of stuff. So if you're interested, feel free to check that out, and I'll see you in the next video.